In the United States Senate, a roll call vote for a landmark infrastructure bill had begun. Senator Frank Morrison watched confidently, believing the bill's passage was assured. One by one, the clerk called the names, and senators answered, "Aye," without hesitation. When the name Reeves echoed through the chamber, the freshman senator rose.
"I object."
Morrison's face went slack with disbelief. The unimaginable had just happened. In the gallery, Morrison's daughter and chief of staff, Carol, clutched the rail, her world tilting. The roots of that objection lay 8 years in the past, at a dinner in Senator Morrison's home.
Daddy says you are politically useless. No name, no money, no future. Be honest with yourself.
23-year-old Paul Reeves set his napkin on the table and walked out of the house, and out of her life, without a word. A silent vow burned in his chest as he drove away. The car sped through the rain, away from the mansion and the woman who had cut him to the bone with a single sentence.
Useless. He gripped the wheel and swore that word would become his fuel, not his epitaph.
At a rest stop hours later, he parked and stared at the empty highway, stretching ahead. He threw his phone into a trash can. No more calls, no more memories, no more Carol. Then he climbed back in and drove toward a state where no one knew the name Paul Reeves.
He had no money, no connections, only a raw determination to prove her wrong.
For hours, the road stretched under the moon, every mile a small distance from the man he had been. As dawn broke, a new city skyline rose before him, unfamiliar and indifferent.
Here, he would disappear and rebuild from nothing but nerve.
He guided the car through the streets and said aloud, the word tasting like a vow, "Start." For the first 2 weeks, he slept curled in the driver's seat of the old sedan, parked in the shadow of a cold storage warehouse.
He told himself this was just the bottom of the mountain. The only direction from here was up.
He found a job moving cargo on the night shift. The work left his back screaming, but it left his mornings free to drag himself to the public library, where he found the only thing that eased the burn in his chest: law.
He started with an introduction to constitutional law, and didn't stop until he'd filled a notebook with every procedural rule the Senate had.
On his off days, he'd spend 12 hours in the quiet reading room, a stack of congressional record volumes beside him.
The words of Carol still echoed, but now they sounded like a challenge he was dating himself to answer.
After 3 months of saving, he rented a room barely bigger than a broom closet. A bed, a desk, and a single bulb, enough.
He'd covered a whole wall with a map of the state's congressional districts, marking incumbents and open seats.
He had no wealth, no backers, and no illusions, but he now possessed something Carol had told him he'd never have: a plan. A year later, his relentless study landed him an unpaid internship in the office of a small-town congressman.
If he just got his foot in the door, he could prove his worth.
He drafted a policy memo on streamlining federal grants that caught the congressman's eye. The congressman told him he hadn't seen work this precise from a staffer in years. When the congressman announced his retirement, he stunned the district by endorsing his young intern for the open seat.
He'd never run a campaign, but he'd spent a year studying every lever of power. Maybe that was enough.
With the endorsement, Paul filed his candidacy. He had no money, but he had a message.
I won't be a rubber stamp. I'll be a senator who reads every line of every bill.
The establishment laughed. An intern running for Congress with only a retired name to back him. But Paul Reeves didn't care about laughter. He'd been laughed at by an expert, and he was still standing. On election night, the margin was razor thin, but by midnight, Paul Reeves was declared the winner of the House seat.
He told himself this was only the first mile of a very long road.
He was sworn into the House of Representatives, the youngest member of the incoming class. Over 4 years, he earned a nickname from the press, Mr. Clean. He blocked pork barrel projects and killed loophole-ridden bills without apology.
I don't care which party wrote the bill. If it's not airtight, I will not vote for it.
When a Senate seat opened, the establishment laughed. He had no machine, no family name, no deep pockets.
But he had a voting record that could not be bought, and he remembered every word Carol had said.
He announced his Senate bid from a folding table in a dusty VFW hall, surrounded by volunteers and pizza boxes. The polls called him a long shot, but he campaigned 12 hours a day, shaking hands until his knuckles ached. On election night, he watched the returns in silence. The margin narrowed, impossibly narrowed, and then held. Senator-elect Paul Reeves walked into the Russell Building alone, his footsteps echoing off the marble.
The last time he was in Washington, he had been an intern with nothing but a borrowed tie and a future wife who pitied him.
At a reception for freshman senators, he spotted a woman across the room whose posture he'd recognize anywhere. Carol Morrison, now her father's chief of staff, stared back, her face draining of color.
This bill will rebuild America. It must pass without delay, by unanimous consent.
The Infrastructure Modernization Act was Morrison's legacy, an 800-page monument to his decades of influence. 3 days later, an aide dropped a thick binder onto Paul's desk. The bill awaited his review.
Carol's father had once called him a nobody. Now he held the future of the man's entire career in his hands.
He opened the cover and began to read, the way he read everything, line by line, rule by rule, searching for the crack no one else bothered to find. He didn't know yet what he would find, but he knew that if it existed, he would be the one to uncover it. For 3 nights, the senator's office lamp burned until dawn as Paul combed through every subsection. On page 642, a single sentence regarding interstate funding stopped his hand. He pulled the Senate Rules Manual from the shelf and read the relevant standing order 3 times.
This isn't a typo. It's a direct procedural contradiction, and it's fatal.
If unanimous consent were requested, a single objection citing that rule would stop the entire bill.
The man she called useless now held a weapon that could erase her father's legacy. He had sworn to uphold the rules without favor, but the past whispered a far more personal kind of justice.
He closed the binder with deliberate care and sat back, his face unreadable. Then he locked the annotated pages in his desk drawer, keeping his discovery entirely to himself.
The flaw existed. The decision of what to do with it, that could wait.
2 days later, Paul walked into the parliamentarian's office, carrying only a photocopy of the flawed provision.
Hypothetically, if a bill contained a provision that contradicted Standing Rule 18, could a unanimous consent request be sustained?
The parliamentarian adjusted his spectacles and answered without hesitation. An objection on those grounds would be procedurally fatal. The ruling would be immediate and absolute. Back in his office, Paul unlocked the drawer and laid the annotated pages flat beside a blank legal notepad. He wrote at the top, Procedural Objection. Standing Rule 18, Section 4. Not for distribution.
Every word had to be about the rule, not about the man. Principle wouldn't allow anything less.
Meanwhile, Morrison's allies fast-tracked the bill. The calendar showed unanimous consent scheduled for Tuesday at 11.
4 days. He folded the speech, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and told no one.
The Senate buzzed with Morrison's confidence. Only one man knew the bill was already dead. The evening before the vote, Morrison hosted a victory dinner under a crystal chandelier.
To my father, and to the bill that defines his legacy.
By this time tomorrow, it will be law. Nothing stands in its path.
Carol's smile was unguarded. She believed their family's power could never be challenged. Alone in his office, Senator Paul Reeves rehearsed his speech aloud, voice steady.
The rule is settled, the objection correct. The law demands it.
He recited the procedural argument until each syllable sounded inevitable.
She called him useless, but this wasn't about her. It was about the rule book.
Before the mirror, he saw superimposed the young intern who had walked out of her father's house. He folded the speech, switched off the light, and stood in the dark. The wait was almost over. Tuesday morning, Paul unlocked the drawer and read his notes one final time.
The rule is unambiguous. The amendment was never formally adopted. It's not personal, it's procedure.
He slid the speech into his breast pocket and walked out into the marble corridors of the Capitol. Outside, the dome gleamed under a clear sky. Inside, history was about to pivot on a single word. Senator Morrison rose from his desk, his voice filling the chamber.
This bill will rebuild our roads, our bridges, our future. It is a monument to what we can achieve together.
Senators around him nodded, ready to rubber stamp the legacy project without debate. The presiding officer called for unanimous consent. The clerk began the roll. Aye, after aye echoed through the chamber. Paul sat motionless as the names drew closer. The clerk's voice cut through the hum. Mr. Reeves. Every muscle in Paul's body tightened. Paul Reeves rose slowly and raised his hand.
Mr. President, I object.
Morrison's head snapped toward the voice. His mouth opened, but no sound came. In the gallery, Carol grabbed the rail, and a sound escaped her, a choked gasp of pure horror. The presiding officer's gavel banged. Senator Reeves, state your grounds.
The bill contains a provision contradicting Standing Rule 18, Section 4. That rule requires a formal amendment that was never offered.
The parliamentarian consulted immediately, nodded gravely from the side. The objection was correct. The presiding officer's voice rang out. The objection is sustained. The bill is dead. Morrison sank into his chair, his face white as the marble pillars. Paul remained standing, his hands steady on the podium, waiting for the chamber to quiet. The presiding officer recognized Senator Reeves for up to 90 seconds. The chamber fell to an unnatural hush.
I did not object because I oppose infrastructure. I object because the bill before us contains a violation of Standing Rule 18, Section 4. That rule requires any provision altering interstate funding to be formally amended on the record. It never was. If we suspend our own rules for convenience, we make a mockery of the oath we took. I will not do that, not for any bill.
He did not mention Morrison, Carol, or the dinner 8 years before. His words were only about the rule. Morrison's face crumbled. The senior senator looked suddenly old. His gavel of authority splintered. Carol's hands trembled visibly on the gallery rail. She looked at Paul as if seeing him for the first time. She mouthed a single word no one heard, but her father, glimpsing it, turned away. The parliamentarian's ruling stood. The bill was dead, and Paul had spoken for only 78 seconds. He sat down, folded his hands, and stared ahead, giving no one the satisfaction of a smile. As the gavel slammed for adjournment, Paul gathered his papers and walked toward the chamber's rear exit. Behind him, Carol nearly stumbled down the gallery stairs, her heels striking the marble in frantic pursuit. She caught him in the narrow corridor outside the cloakroom, her breath ragged.
Paul, wait, why? You could have warned us. He's my father. Why would you humiliate him like that?
It was a procedural objection, Carol. Nothing personal.
He said it without warmth, as if reading from a statute. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Carol's face collapsed. The tears she'd been holding since the gallery broke loose. Paul walked past her toward the elevator, his footsteps unhurried, his posture unchallenged. She stood alone under the harsh light, the echo of his footsteps, the only answer to her sobs. In Senator Morrison's office, the phones began to ring and never stopped.
That nobody, that insignificant freshman, just destroyed a decade of work.
Staffers scrambled to issue a press release, but every angle made it worse. A senator killed by his own rulebook. Carol walked in, her face still pale from the corridor, and said nothing. On every television screen, the chyron repeated, "Infrastructure bill killed by procedural objection." Talking heads split instantly. Some called Paul Reeves a hero of the rulebook. Others a viper who burned down the institution. Leaked internal polls showed Morrison's approval rating collapsing among independents, dropping 20 points in a single day. Carol sat at her desk, staring blankly at the roll call sheet with her father's name circled. She did not move. By midnight, Morrison sat alone in his darkened office, the gavel he'd wielded for decades resting untouched. His chief of staff emailed a resignation at dawn. The Morrison era was over, and everyone in Washington knew it. That evening, rain streaked the windshield as Paul drove the long road home. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. The screen read, "Carol Morrison." He let it ring twice, then pressed answer.
Paul, please, just tell me why you didn't warn us. We could have fixed it.
Her voice cracked with exhaustion. In the background, a news anchor still narrated the bill's death.
Carol, I was politically useless. I assumed I still was.
He spoke the words without venom, as if citing a long-memorized fact. On the line, a single broken sob, then silence. He pressed end call. Across the city, Carol sat motionless, the phone still pressed to her ear, her reflection pale in the dark window. Paul placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove on. The rain blurred the taillights ahead. He did not look back. In the weeks that followed, Senator Morrison's once unassailable influence crumbled into irrelevance. He announced he would not seek re-election, citing health. Those who knew him understood. His legacy had been hollowed out. Within a year, he spent his days in a quiet retirement, the Senate a distant, bitter memory. Carol Morrison left Washington entirely. She took a position at a small nonprofit in a city where her father's name meant nothing. She now worked in a cramped cubicle, far from the marble corridors she once commanded. Senator Paul Reeves, meanwhile, walked through the Capitol with a reputation that silenced rooms. Colleagues regarded him warily, but no one dared challenge his procedural mastery again. Newspapers ran retrospectives on the Reeves objection, the moment a freshman senator killed a giant with a rulebook. Morrison's portrait hung in the Senate corridor, but no one stopped to look at it anymore. Paul had done nothing more than his job, and that was the most devastating thing of all. Months later, Senator Paul Reeves agreed to a rare televised interview on governance and principle. The host asked directly whether the Morrison objection had ever been personal.
It was not personal. It was procedural. The bill's flaw was public, and the rule was clear. If a man's legacy cannot survive a single objection based on our own standing rules, then that legacy was already broken.
The interviewer sat back, unsettled. The answer was surgical, and it gave away nothing. In his quiet home, Frank Morrison watched the broadcast from a recliner, the remote trembling. His face betrayed no reaction, but his hand tightened until his knuckles went white. He stood up abruptly, turned off the screen, and stood in the dark, alone with his thoughts. Paul Reeves, unbothered by the broadcast, was back in his office, reviewing new legislation. He underlined a line, closed the binder, and reached for the next bill. There was always more work. An aide handed him a folded paper from a constituent, a child's letter. The note read, Thank you for being honest, Senator. Paul read it twice, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a rare, genuine smile. He folded the note and unlocked his desk drawer, where he kept the few things that mattered. Inside, beneath a stack of files, lay a yellowed clipping from his first election victory. He laid the child's note atop the clipping, as if adding the final sentence to a long, argued case. The man who had once been called useless now saw, in a schoolchild's gratitude, a verdict far more final than any senator could deliver. He closed the drawer and turned to the window, the Capitol dome glowing against the evening sky. The anger that had driven him for years was quiet now, replaced by something simpler: satisfaction. He allowed himself a single unguarded smile, the kind that had been 8 years in the making. Late evening, Paul sat alone in his office, the only light coming from his desk lamp and the glowing Capitol dome beyond the window.
He looked up at the dome and let his mind drift back, just for a moment, to a dinner table years ago.
He saw the young man he had been, sitting stiffly as a woman's voice cut through the clinking silverware. "You are politically useless." That young intern had walked out into the rain with nothing but a vow. Now, a senator stood in his place.
The memory no longer stung. It was just a fact now, a piece of history he had rewritten.
He turned from the window, the city's lights stretching below, and nodded once, a small, solemn gesture. The man he had become had done what that boy couldn't. He'd proven his worth without raising his voice.
Justice, he realized, was not loud. It was a quiet, procedural thing that echoed long after the gavel fell.
He reached for the next bill on the stack, a fresh notepad beside him. There was always more work outside. The Capitol dome stood steady in the night, a silent witness to a long, quiet journey. He switched off the desk lamp, and the office fell into a soft darkness, lit only by the distant Capitol dome. The door clicked behind him as he stepped into the corridor. His footsteps were the only sound in the empty Senate office building. No aides, no reporters, no witnesses now. Just the long, polished hallway before him. He walked toward the glow of the exit sign, his silhouette sharp against the light. With each step, the figure grew smaller, swallowed by the perspective of the grand corridor. Outside, the Capitol dome stood under the stars, unchanged and indifferent, as it always had. But inside, the quiet wasn't empty. It held the echo of a rule that had toppled a titan. Some revenges aren't shouted. They're whispered in the echo of a rulebook, and they last forever. A single man, doing his job, and nothing more. Far from the Capitol, Senator Morrison sat alone, the newspaper on his lap, its headline already fading into yesterday. In a nondescript office building, Carol tabulated columns of numbers, her visitor's badge bearing a name no one recognized. The Capitol dome, however, remained unchanged, shining under the same sun that had watched the entire quiet war. Inside, the corridor where Paul had walked now lay empty, holding only the memory of his footsteps. No plaque, no ceremony, no statue, just the knowledge that a rule had been upheld, and a titan had fallen because of it. Some victories are temporary. A procedural objection, rooted in truth, never expires, and the man who had delivered it, the one they had called useless, required no further honor. The state sent no thank you notes. The press eventually moved on. But the legislative record would never forget, and sometimes that's the only revenge worth having, the one written in the permanent margins of history. He had been politically useless, and so he had done the most useful thing of all. Morning light slanted through the Capitol windows as Senator Reeves unlocked his office and sat at the same mahogany desk. He opened the bottom drawer, just for a moment, and glanced at the folded note on top of the yellowed clipping. He did not need to read it again. The words had already settled into the deepest part of him. Through the window, the dome rose against a pale winter sky, indifferent to the man who had reshaped its history. He turned back to the bill on his desk and began to read, line by line, as he always did. The pen moved steadily, marking a clause that would need amendment. There was always more work. The office was silent save for the scratch of pen on paper. No aides, no cameras, only the work. Outside, the city hummed with the endless noise of politics, but in that small room, a rule was being honored. On a shelf behind him, the Senate rulebook stood, its spine cracked from years of use. A single section was dog-eared. Standing Rule 18, Section 4. The man they had called useless had done nothing more than read the fine print, and in doing so he had built the only legacy that ever mattered, his own.